Hi, I'm Ellie and I'm currently in the process of converting this 2007 Toyota Hiace into a camper van for van life. Now at last that ugly insulation that's been in the background for the past few videos is gone because at last I have put the walls in and it's really starting to look like somewhere that I'll actually be living in a month's time. It's completely changed the whole feel of the place, so let me show you how I did it. I'm Ellie Wilder and you're watching Wilder in Motion. When I stripped back the walls in a previous video, I exposed the internal cabling of the van. So I wanted to make sure that this was protected from the insulation. I found some flexible plastic tubing in the gardening irrigation section of Bunnings and cut this long ways so that I could wrap it around the cables, and then I secured that with some electrical tape. In my design video, I spoke about having a wooden bench top secured to the wall with hinges so that it could be up against the wall or down when it's in use. I knew I needed a strong material to brace this to, but I wasn't sure what to go with because I knew that there's always the risk of the wood rotting when it's in direct contact with the metal. And then I came up with this. This is something that I've used before. It's called mod wood and it's actually fake wood. It's made of plastic, recycled materials, and this means that there's no chance of it rotting. So what I did was cut up some sections of this and using liquid nails glue it onto the wall. And this means when the wall goes over the top, my hinges can be secured with the screws anchoring into this sturdy material. A common method is to attach some wooden beams to the walls, put insulation in between, and then put the walling material over the top. I didn't do this because I wanted to maximize the width of my van and work with the existing curved shape as well. And so because of this, I've decided to only insulate in the existing divots caused by where windows would be in other models, and also the lower areas that were exposed after I removed the paneling. For the bulk of the wall insulation, I used some foam board. This stuff is pretty cheap. It was pretty easy to cut out with a Stanley knife and a handsaw, and I made sure to label all of the sections so that I knew which piece corresponded to which part of the van. There are lots of different types of foam board to choose from. I went with this particular one because it was the right thickness and it was also readily available and affordable at my local hardware store. My first choice for attaching this was some spray adhesive, and I used about a third of the can spraying the backs of the foam and then also went in on one of the wall sections. But I pretty quickly worked out that it was not at all sticky or suitable for what I was doing. I think part of this was because the van is slightly curved but the foam board is very rigid. There wasn't enough contact points. The other thing was the type of foam board I used didn't have any kind of covering on it, so potentially the adhesive might have just been securing to the loose fibers on the outside and not actually getting stuck to the bulk of the board itself. Either way, it didn't work at all, so instead I just went in with a couple of dots of liquid nails and that did the job just fine. So it was a matter of matching up the foam board panels with their corresponding areas on the wall. Then I went around the edges with the same kind of spray foam filler I used on the floor. I couldn't use the sheet foam on the rear panel of my van as access was a little difficult. However, I did have a big bag of offcuts from the spray foam I used on the floor. So instead I broke this up into little pieces and shoved as much of it into this rear panel as possible so that it could be properly insulated, and then I used a tiny bit of spray foam insulation to seal it in place in between the cracks that were left. I've spoken in the past about my method of getting electricity, which will be via a solar setup, and the normal thing to do would be to put the cables in the walls at this point. I've decided not to do that because some of the cables in my system are quite bulky, so to have them sit flush with all the interior workings inside the wall, I would need to drill through some of the metal areas, which I'd rather avoid doing, especially when if I put the cables on the outside of the wall, I can put them in some ducting, which will keep things looking clean and nice, but it will also make them accessible in the future, so if there's any issues or if I want to expand my solar setup or add another power point, I can do that very easily. Now, I've seen so many van life YouTubers using the tongue and groove wood system to panel their vans with, and this is basically long pieces of wood that slot into each other and then wrapping their whole van ceiling and walls in this material. I'm not entirely sure why so many people choose this option. The only thing I can see going for it is the look. The disadvantages are you're adding a lot of extra material that not only adds weight but also a good 9 to 12 millimeters. Also, each individual piece needs to be cut to length, so that's a lot of cuts and a lot of measurements, and every single piece needs to be individually anchored at multiple points to the battens of the van. So for me, I just wasn't too keen on that, and I'd rather work with the shape of the van itself because the Hiace does have a lot of bumps and things like that, and that's why I decided to go with large sheet panels. I chose the 3mm MDF because you can buy it in large sheets, which makes the job quicker. It's also easy to cut, it can mold to the curves of the edge of the van, and it also has a look that's a bit similar to plasterboard, which helps with the homely feel. So to cut this to shape, I took the entire panel, put it as close to the wall as possible and drew around it roughly. I then cut this out and went back, checked my measurements, cut a little bit more off, and so on until I had a shape that I was happy with, which I then transferred onto another piece so I would have wall panels for both sides. I repeated this for all the areas of the van. I've used this method for the largest, flattest areas of the van, but I've left the metal raw in the areas that are very curved in between. I decided to invest my time more in restoring the metal rather than just trying to cover it over completely. I was also able to use some of the old panels I had ripped out as templates, and I was even able to restore this one, which is actually the original panel that's just been painted. I've spoken before about how I'm terrified of mold growth, and for that reason I'll be sealing all the wood in the van because I'm going to be traveling in a very humid area. So here's a bit of a money saving tip. If you go to Bunnings, there's a table in the paint section with paint on clearance. This is a liter of paint. This would normally cost about $30, but I got it for $10 because it was a mist tint. I wasn't too fussed about what color this was since it's just going to be on the back side of the wood to seal it. So that's why I just went with the type of paint which is mold resistant as opposed to being fussy on the color. I painted the back of the wood with some cheap paint that was good quality but not the color that I wanted since I won't be able to see it anyway. And I used my preferred color, which is just a simple white for the front and the edges of the panels. I needed to use 2 coats of this white paint in some areas. And with that all dried, I could finally install the panels in the van. And of course, I looked to my trusty liquid nails to get this done. I will say it was a little difficult to secure some of the panels because they just didn't want to stay in place, and I didn't have any kind of proper bracing, so I was just kind of winging it with some spare pieces of wood that I had lying around, but I got there in the end, which is the important part. It just took a little bit of persuasion. For some of the panels, I still had the plugs that were used to secure them originally left, so I used those as an added support. And with everything in place, I went around the edges with some silicone to neaten things up. I had to do the main wall panels in 2 different pieces, so I used some powder filler mixed with water to fill in the gap to make it nice and flush. So that's where I'm up to at the moment, but very soon I'll be sanding back the filler and painting over it so everything looks nice and uniform, and I'll also be spray painting the exposed metal to give it a nice new lease of life. So here are my van walls. I'm so thrilled to finally have them in. The van is really starting to look like a tiny home, and the MDF walls not only were nice and simple to install, but they also give it that plasterboard-like look that you would find in a house, and it's starting to feel like a tiny home and not just a skeletal van anymore. So pretty soon I will be able to put the vinyl flooring in, and then we will be on to furniture. It's hard to imagine how this is going to look when it's done, but I cannot wait to continue with this transformation. So if you want to be a part of this journey with me, then please like, subscribe, and I'll see you next time.